Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Nitish, and in this video we're going to take a look at how do you understand the large code bases of a project. I will typically share with you my approach on understanding the code base of a project. You might have heard people saying oftentimes, hey, you know what, run unit tests to understand the code base, set up the project locally, try to see the logs and things like that. We'll be trying to understand what are these statements, and I'm pretty sure if you watch the video till the very end, you'll be very confident in trying to understand a project's code base. So without any further delay, let's get started. So what is the first thing that you need to do in order to understand any project? The first very basic thing that you need to do is play with the project for 1 to 2 weeks. Okay. It can be like just try to be a user of the project before being a contributor. Okay. Try to play with the project, try to play with its features, try to understand what is this project, eventually what is the problem that it's trying to do, go through its readme, try to understand like very basic stuff. Take your time from 1 to 2 weeks, that's completely fine. The point that I'm trying to make here is you have to be a user of that project first before becoming a contributor to that project. So that's the first step. That's a very important step. Okay. Second point that you need to understand is once you have got a very basic understanding of, okay, this is the problem that this project is trying to solve, the next important step will be trying to understand the, let me just understand the project architecture. Okay. Try to understand the project architecture. Now, oftentimes, all these projects might have documentation on how the architecture of the project looks like. And why I'm telling you to understand the architecture of the project, because oftentimes these big projects that you're trying to learn the code base of, these projects are generally distributed, which means they have certain specific components, and all these specific components are doing some specific job for you. So just try to get a very minimal basic understanding of how the project architecture is going to look like. For example, if I try to go through the Argo CD's project, Argo CD, let's say Argo CD architecture. Okay, I try to go through it. You can see that there's a very nice documentation that says how the architecture is going to look like for you. Okay, so you see they are specifying there's a component, an API server, repository server, and you might not be even able to understand what is this architecture doing right now. Okay, and that's completely fine, but just get a basic overview. Okay, this is how the architecture of the project looks like. This is the component. This is what this is how they're interacting with each other, and that's all you have to know for now. Okay, what's next thing that you need to do? Once you've got a basic understanding of how the project architecture looks like, the next important step that you need to do will be set up the project locally. Now you might ask me, Dish, how do I set up the project locally? Again, documentation is your best friend here. If you go to the, I'm just taking an example of Argo CD here, but you can go through any project that you would want to contribute to. They will be having some documentations for developers specifically. They will be having documentation for users. You as a developer would want to go through the developer guide. For example, Argo CD, this project has a developer guide. So if you go through the overview section, it has every information like what you need to do. You need to fork the project, clone the project. This is how you submit the PR. If I go through the architecture, they have specified the architecture according to a developer's perspective here. So if I go to the architecture, you see they have specified how the architecture looks like, component architecture as we were talking about. Okay. So try to set up the project locally. When I say set up the project locally, like try to run the project. For example, here they have mentioned about how to, how to run the Argo CD locally. Okay, for example, I will follow the same exact instructions to make sure my project is now working locally on my machine. Okay. You don't want to run the project as a user. That you have already done for 1 to 2 weeks at the first. Now you want to run the project as a developer. It's like if you make some changes to the code, you can see those changes being live on your local machine. Okay. That's what it means when we say that you have to set up the project locally on your machine. Like, okay, that's what we mean. Now, once you've got a basic understanding of how to set up the project locally, you figured out, okay, this is some bugs that I was coming across, whatever the stuff. You got some help from somewhere. Now you're setting up the project locally, which is perfectly well. The next step that you need to do right now is the main step, which is code, which is basically go through the code or pick an issue. And this is very complex here, not complex here, but this is something that you need to pay some attention. If you just try to go through the code, if you just try to go through the code, you won't be able to understand anything. Why? Because there's no motive for you. What is the motive for you to try to understand the code of this project? What is the motive? You don't have any motive right now, so you'll feel stuck somewhere, like how to understand the code. So if you want to go with this approach, it's like just randomly going through the code. I would typically recommend you doing is like pick specific operation of a project. When I say operation, it's very simple. So let's say you are doing your project is solving a specific problem. Try to pick some specific action that this project does. For example, in Argo CD's perspective, it can be like trying to sync your cluster to your desired state. Okay, I'll be picking this very specific operation, and I'll try to examine the logs. Now, when I say examine the logs, it's like you'll be setting up the project locally. Okay, you'll be going through the code. Now you see that, okay, whenever I perform a sync, there are logs that are appearing on my local project locally. Okay, I'll be seeing those logs in the where those logs have been written in the code base. Okay, for example, let me just try to show you something. So let's say if I go through the controllers code base, I go through any like cache.go, things like that. You'll be seeing there have been some sort of logs that will be written here. Okay, so example, you see, if you see in your project locally, circular dependency detected log is there. This means this function is getting called. Okay, that's very simple. If you don't want to go with this approach, which I would not typically recommend for now, what I would typically recommend you doing is pick up an issue. And when I say pick up an issue, try to especially pick an issue which is about fixing a bug for now. It can be good first issue, it cannot be good first issue, but try to pick a very simple issue for now and try to understand it. Okay, like, so if you picked an issue, what's the important thing that you need to do? If you picked up an issue, the important thing that you need to do right now here will be reproduce the issue locally. Okay, reproduce the issue locally. Once you have reproduced the issue locally, what you need to do right now is try to understand what sort of error is getting in that bug fix. Okay, you want to what sort of error is getting in that bug. Once you have got that, okay, this is a specific line that is getting appeared here. Just do just try to search the line. Where is that line written in the code base? All you need to do is draw the diagram. What do you mean by draw the diagram? Let's take an example of health.co. Okay, there's a very simple function. Let's say this function was getting executed for you. Now you don't, okay, let's say this function was getting executed, like there was an error, there were some logs that you were getting, this sort of error, failed to get resources. You know that this function was getting called. Why? Because you see this line getting appeared on your logs. So you get an idea, you make an assumption that this function is getting called here. So now you try to see which function is calling this function. You'll go through it and you see that, okay, this is the line, but this is a comment, so it's not any use of us. Then you see, okay, state.go is a function. The state.go is a file that is calling this function. So you see here, then you see, okay, this function is getting called in the compare app. It means compare app state would have been called before that function. Now see where compare app is getting called. So since I'm in the controller, I'm just assuming, okay, it might have been called here, okay, this function is getting called here. Then I see where is this function in which this function was lying is called here. Then I see this was getting called here. So, and then I automatically come back to run here, and then I see where is run getting called. If I go to the run, you see it was getting called in the run e function, like a new command function. So I got a diagram. Okay, the code started from new command. Then we came to, then we came to where? We came to the run function. Once we came to the run function, the run function internally called, the process app operation queue item. Once it called the process app operation queue item, I know that it was calling some sort of like a compare app state function, right? Now compare app state function was internally calling what? It was calling internally, your set application health. And since it was calling that, I got this error here. So now you got a basic flow of how to fix that bug. Now you might ask me, Nish, I don't really understand how to, uh, you know, I don't really understand how to understand this function. Like I don't know what is this function trying to do. So this is the time when your tests are going to help you, and you see people coming to you and telling you to run the unit test. This is where it's time for you. So go through the set application health, see where the tests have been written. So you see the tests have been written here. Okay, I go through it and I now try to run these unit tests. So this is all the tests that have been written. I'll set some debug breakpoints here. For example, this is a breakpoint. I'm going to set here. I'm going to say click here. I'm going to say debug, things like that. And then automatically the test is going to get started. And then you can set one breakpoint on this function, so whenever this is going to get executed, automatically you're going to come here. So you run the unit test. Unit tests are basically the test for the function with different values. For example, resources can have different values, statuses can have different values. That is telling you how this set application health is going to behave for different inputs for you. Okay, so this is how you typically understand the unit test. Now a question comes is, what if I want to implement a feature, right? And this is quite challenging. If you want to implement a feature, I would not recommend it at making your first contribution if you're not familiar with the project. I would first recommend you play with the project, get an basic understanding of how the code is flowing. So now you've got an understanding, and then once you've got a basic understanding, try to then work on some sort of a big feature if you want to work on. Okay, and yeah, that's it. Like, this is how, if you now come across some specific another bug, again you start with the same process. Is like, you just try to go through the project architecture, you run the project locally. Okay, now you go through the code. If you can also reproduce the issue locally. Then you draw the diagram, you see in which line is this function being called, in which line is this function, in which line is this, sorry, in which function is this line, and then where is this function getting called, where is that function getting called, where is that function getting called. So some sort of diagram that you need to just remember. And if you just go through the diagrams, you create the diagrams, you will be ending up coming to the main function. Like, for example, here, if I show you right now, we were calling the health.go here. You were here, state.go, it was getting called in compare app state. Compare app state was getting called where? It was in process app. Process app was getting called where? It was getting called in run. Where was run getting called? Run was getting called in your new command. Where is new command getting called? New command was getting called in main.go. You see, function main. So now you understood. Oh, I started with function main. Now function main, obviously function main is going to get executed. Then okay, this was a get command that was getting executed. This was a function that was getting executed. Then it internally called, run function, run internally called, your compare app state internally called your set application. So you got a basic flow of code. And this is how you typically, you get yourself issue some assigned, and then you start with it. Now, what happens if you're not able to find some issue to work upon, or you don't know about the complexity? As I already mentioned in one of my tweets, that what you can do is go through the project and search for to-dos. Okay. So for example, to-do. You see a lot of to-dos are there. So to-dos are generally the pieces of code that you would want, that developers want you to work on. I mean, don't want you to, obviously. Developers want these things to be done in the project, but they aren't able to do that because of certain reasons that they weren't able to do that. You can pick these to-dos, and then you can eventually work on that. For example, like here the to-do is, we need to better way to detect the duplicate. So just try to understand what is this function eventually doing here, and if they have unit tests, try to run those unit tests, try to understand that function, and then complete those to-dos for you. So that's it. I really hope you guys have liked this video. If you guys did, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.